Now I'm ready to work the last quarter of the piece. I've turned the corner in exactly the same way as I did previously, with the extra little pinhole on the inside edge. And now this last quarter is ready to work. So I have a diamond in the middle, which I'm going to work in half stitch. I have a set of rose ground, which over here in the first section, or in the second section, I did a set of double rows. This time I'm going to work single rows, which I'll explain to you when I get there. I'm going to do a little simple cloth stitch spider again, as I did in this first video, and I'm returning to the half stitch fan as I did over on the second piece. So I'm going to work that half stitch fan, that first spider, that second fan, and then I'll be able to get on with the rows. So let's crack on with our fan. So just a quick reminder, cloth stitch through the first, cloth stitch and twist through the first pair. I'm going to pop a twist on that pair because it's coming out of a cloth stitch fan, and half stitch through that. That's my extra fan passive, and then I'm going to bring the first pair in from the previous fan, making sure I've got a twist on it. Half stitch through there and put a twist on my worker. Pin up, then back in half stitch till I reach the edge, cloth stitch and twist, extra twist on the worker and pin up, cloth stitch and twist back, half stitch through 1, 2, 3 pairs, new one coming in, making sure it's got a twist coming off the previous section, extra twist on that worker and pin, half stitch back, cloth stitch and twist through that last pair, extra twist on the worker and pin, cloth stitch and twist, half stitch through to pick up the next pair, extra twist on my worker and pin. So I'm working this much quicker than I did previously. You can refer back to the second part of the video to see how to do a half stitch fan, where I work it a little bit more slowly and carefully. So coming through to the right, bring our last pair in, and that's the end of that fan. So I'm going to leave that open and come along and work this spider. So again, I've got 1, 2, 3, I've got 4 pairs coming from the left, and I want 4 from the right. So I'm going to start off with my foundation ground on either side of the spider, then I'll work the spider in the middle, and then the ground afterwards. Again, I'll work through this a little bit speedier, but you can go back to the previous video to watch it much slower. So this is just a little reminder really. So I'm going to work down this line of ground to the left here. So I'm working each stitch in half stitch, pin half stitch along the line of ground. So that's as far as I can go there. So I'm going to come back to the top and work down the other side. Again, half stitch, pin half stitch along that line. So we need to focus on the 4 pairs for the legs, which is 2 legs either side, an extra twist on each of those pairs so that we've got 2 twists on each pair. As I said earlier, the number of twists on your spider's legs is dictated by the number of legs from each side. So I've got 2 legs on each side, I'm working 2 twists. So then I'm going to work my spider. So I'm crossing the pairs through each other. So the 2 pairs on the left have worked in cloth stitch through the 2 pairs on the right. pop a pin in the middle and repeat. So the 2 pairs from the left go through the 2 pairs from the right. Put my 2 twists on each leg. Then I can fill in the ground down the left and then down the right hand side. There we go. So I'm going to work that next fan, then we can do the rose ground. So now I'm ready to work the rose ground. So I'm going to do a single rose here, which means where I did cloth stitch and twist for my foundation stitch on this rose ground over here, I'm going to do a foundation stitch of half stitch on either side for this new one. So I'm going to take the 2 pairs from the left for this top rose, making sure they're twisted from the previous stitches, and I'm going to put half stitch on those. Then I'm going to bring the 2 pairs in from the right, again making sure they've got a twist on them from the previous section of work, and I'm going to put a half stitch on those. Then I'm going to work the 4 middle pins for the rose. So with the 2 centre pairs, I'm going to work half stitch, pin, half stitch, then the 2 left hand pairs, half stitch, pin, half stitch, then back to the 2 right hand pairs, half stitch, pin, half stitch, and finally the 2 middle pairs, half stitch, pin, half stitch. Not forgetting, we need to put the foundation stitch on again at the end, so we'll put a half stitch on those 2 pairs at the right, and we'll put a half stitch on those 2 pairs there. So these 2 pairs are done with now. We'll bring these 2 left hand pairs round to become the new right hand pairs, and we'll bring our new 2 pairs in from the left. So our right hand pairs have already got their foundation stitch because we just did that coming out of the rose. So we need to put a foundation stitch on these 2 pairs from the left. So we'll half stitch those. Then again, with the 4 pairs, we'll work the following sequence. With the 2 middle pairs, half stitch, pin, half stitch. With the 2 left hand pairs, half stitch, pin, half stitch. With the 2 right hand pairs, half stitch, pin, half stitch, and then back to the 2 middle pairs, half stitch, pin, half stitch. Foundation stitch of half stitch on the right, and a foundation stitch of half stitch on the left. The right hand pairs move out of the way. The left hand pairs become our new right hand pairs, and 2 new pairs for the left. These have already got their foundation stitch on, so we put a half stitch on the 2 from the left. Then again to the middle, half stitch, pin, half stitch. The 2 on the left, half stitch, pin, half stitch. The 2 on the right, half stitch, pin, half stitch, and the 2 centre pairs, half stitch, pin, half stitch. Finish off with our foundation stitch of half stitch on the right and our foundation stitch of half stitch on the left. Move the right hand pairs out of the way. The left hand pairs become the right hand pairs, and a new set of pairs for the left. These have their foundation stitch on, so we add our half stitch to the new left hand pairs. And then one more time, with the middle 2 pairs, half stitch, pin, half stitch, the 2 to the left, half stitch, pin, half stitch, the 2 to the right, half stitch, pin, half stitch, and the 2 middle pairs, half stitch, pin, half stitch. Work our foundation stitch on the right hand side with 2 pairs, half stitch, and our foundation on the left hand side, half stitch with those 2 pairs. So we've done the first 4 roses. We can't carry on with these ones because the pairs we need for those will come out of the diamond, and we can't do the fan because we've only got 2 pairs coming in from the rose. We need more, so we need to do the diamond next, then the rose ground, then we can finish the 3rd fan, the 2nd spider, and the 4th fan. So moving across, we're going to pick up and work our diamonds. So I'm being very careful to make sure I keep these in order because they've got their half stitch on as they come out of the rose ground, and I don't want to lose that. Then I can bring my pairs in from the right, making sure that they've got a twist on them because they were coming out of that cloth stitch on the other side. So looking at the top of the diamond, again, as with the trail, I've got my working line marked out on my pattern, which tells me that from the first pin I should be working off to the left. So my worker will be coming from this pair here, come round that pin, and then head off in that direction. So I'm going to bring a pair from the left and a pair from the right, and I'm going to work half stitch, twist the right hand pair, which will be my worker, 1 extra time, and pin. Then working to the left, I'm going to half stitch through 1 and bring in a 2nd new pair, twist the worker 1 extra time and pin, half stitch back through 1, 2, and then bring in 1 from the right, extra twist on the worker and pin. Again back to the left, 2, 3, and 1 more pair from the left, 4, extra twist on the worker and pin, and back, 2, 3, 4, 1 more pair from the right. So I'm going to continue taking in 1 pair at each side until we get to the widest point of our diamond. Remembering that extra twist on the worker when you get to the end of the row. Now what that extra twist on the worker does is it makes sure that the leading thread in your worker pair is the same. So for the whole of this diamond, it will be the same bobbin working backwards and forwards as the leading thread in that worker. And this helps you to get a nice even tension when you're tensioning up your diamond. Extra twist and back. And you run in on the right, extra twist on the worker and pin before working back. Bring one in on the left, extra twist on the worker, and that's the widest point there on the left hand side. So that's the last time on the left that we'll be taking a pair in. Go back to the right. Then we'll take our last pair in on the right, put that extra twist on the worker. So now that's our widest point, and from now we'll start leaving a pair out at each pinhole as the diamond narrows down to the point at the bottom. So we're not going to work through that last one. Twist the worker an extra time and pin. Leave one out at the right hand side, and we'll carry on in this way, leaving one out at each side till we get to the last pin at the bottom. Use that one out, extra twist on my worker. Leave one out there, extra twist. Come back, leaving one out there, extra twist, then the last pinhole, close that with a half stitch. So now we've got one pair coming out at each pinhole on the left and one coming out at each pinhole on the right. So those ones on the right, they just need to be sewn in when we finish this section now. So we're reducing the number of pairs we need to finish this quarter. So we can go ahead and work this next section of rose ground now that we have the pairs in place for it. So if I bring these two from the left, you can see they've already got their half stitch foundation on. So I'll bring my two pairs from the right and work those in half stitch. Then it's the center two pairs, the two on the left, the two on the right, and the center two again. Foundation stitch on those coming out, foundation stitch on those for the next one. Put foundation stitch on these and we'll work our middle. So top, left, right, middle at the bottom. Half stitch foundation on the left, half stitch foundation on the right. New two pairs in from the right, half stitch foundation, and then we'll do the middle two. The two on the left, the two on the right, and the two in the middle at the bottom. foundation on these two, and foundation on these two. So now I'm going to finish the third fan, the spider and the last fan, and then I'll show you how to sew in all your pairs. So I'm working this fan on the left, so the fan as you would normally work it, but you just need to be a little bit careful, because where the pairs are coming out of the rows, you need to make sure you keep that foundation stitch on them when you're taking them in to the fan. Otherwise your rows won't look like a rose, and it'll look like it's sort of half a rose to start with, and then it sort of turns into just ordinary ground stitch. That's why you need to keep that foundation row, or that foundation stitch I should say. So again, looking at the next two, just making sure the foundation stitch is on before I take the first pair in to work my fan. So just coming to the end of that final fan now, that's my last pinhole of the fan. Put that pin in there. Then I'm going to cloth stitch and twist back through the edge pair, half stitch through that extra fan passive, put an extra twist on the worker, and there's one more pinhole, which is that one sort of part way round the corner. Pin in there under the worker, bring back through the passive, cloth stitch and twist through the edge. And I'm going to pause there because now we're ready to start to sew the pairs in. And I'm going to start off, so if I zoom in hopefully so you can see a bit clearer, and let's reposition a little bit. So the first pair I'm going to sew in is not these two edge workers, but I'm going to sew in that next pinhole there, which is that additional passive that we put in for the fan. And the reason I'm sewing this in before I do these two at the edge, is because once those are sewn in, you're going to struggle to see that hole, and they're all a bit tight anyway. So I'm going to take the pin out. You can just see a pin loop where the pin was. I'm going to get my hook, and this is a 0.6mm crochet hook. I'm going to get that into that little pinhole there. It's now being stubborn. Okay, then I'm going to pick up one of the threads, so I'm picking up the left hand thread, bring it through the loop, so I've got a loop. Then I'm going to pick up the partner bobbin for that pair and put it through the loop. Tension that up. I've just got that hooked around that next pin. Make sure it's not hooked around a pin, because otherwise you're going to have a loose sewing, and we don't want that. In fact, I'm going to take that pin out and put it back in so I can get the thread out of the way. Then I'm going to tie a reef knot and a half, so with right bobbin over left and under the thread, left bobbin over the right and under the thread, right bobbin over left and under the thread. Then I'm going to lay that to the back of the pillow. So next I'm going to sew in these two pairs here, and if you remember back at the beginning I put in a pair of magic threads, and that's going to help us with these sewings because you've got one loop and you could see how tight that second pair was that that third pair was that I just sewed in. That this would be a real struggle. I mean obviously I've got my magic loops through there, but if I zoom in, that really is a very, very tight section. So I'm going to use my magic loops, my magic threads. So picking up the first one, I shall open them out. So I have got my knotted end here and my loop end here. So I'm going to take the pair of bobbins that I'm going to sew in, and I'm going to put one of the bobbins through that loop of the magic thread. Then I'm going to pull the thread up and through, and can you see now I've pulled a loop of my working thread through. I can snip my magic thread away, and then I can continue to make my sewing. So I shall pick up the partner bobbin for that pair, bring that through, and then I can tie that off in a reef knot and a half. And lay it back. Then I can release my second magic thread. Again, separate it out, so I've got the loop. And get my other pair of bobbins, pass one bobbin through that loop, then pull the loop up to pull the thread through. Snip my magic thread away, being careful to snip your magic thread and not your working thread. And now my loop, I can put the partner bobbin through. Let's take some of those twists off that loop. That's twisted up a bit. And again, I can tie that pair off with a reef knot and a half. You can use magic threads for your whole piece. I've only used them on these two because I think they were the really tricky ones. But there's nothing to stop you putting magic threads in when you hang all of your new pairs into a piece of work. And as you can see, it makes making the sewings off so much easier because you're not fighting to get your hook into that pinhole. So now I'm going to carry on. Let's zoom out a little bit so you can see. And I'm going to sew all of the pairs into their corresponding pinhole across that line all the way down till I get to the bottom. So again, put my hook through, pick up one thread of the pair, bring it back through to make a loop, pass the partner through, then tie off with a reef knot and a half. Lay that to the back of my pillow, bring my next pair down, making sure there's a twist between where it comes out of the work and where it's making the sewing. Take the next pin out. Make my loop, put my bobbin through my loop and tie a reef knot and a half. And lay back. I've come to the point now where I'm sewing out where I came from the rose ground in the previous section. So you've got to, as I said before, when you're going from one section to another, you need to remember to keep your foundation stitch. So the same goes when you're working into a sewing off. I need to make sure I've got that foundation stitch, that half stitch in this case, before I sew off. Otherwise it's going to look like you're sewing out of ground into the next section. It's worth mentioning here, if you're starting a piece and you're starting the rose ground, that the threads coming in from the right hand side, as it will be when you're working the new threads in, you don't put a foundation stitch on your rose ground there, because you're working on support pins and the threads are just going to drop down onto your pins. But you must make sure that the foundation stitch is on there coming back into it to sew off. So when you're starting with rose ground, you won't have that foundation stitch on the side coming in new to the lace, but you must remember to put it in on the threads coming out when you're sewing in. That's my second one from that rose ground, sewing off into that half stitch section. And sewing off into half stitch is so much easier because the loops are bigger around the pin. It's not quite so tight as sewing in cloth stitch. And the very last one, that's the last pair sewn off. I'm going to bring all the bobbins round, and then I'm just going to trim them off long for now. And then there are two camps now. There are some people who like to leave their lace to set for 24 hours before they unpin. And if that's what you prefer to do, that's absolutely fine, and carry on. But it's really not necessary. By the time you've worked it, your lace is set, you know, it's not going anywhere. So you can now cut off those ends. So I'm just going to cut those ends off, and then I'm going to unpin. So I've got this pair of scissors with a curved blade. They're an embroidery scissor and they've got a curved blade, so when you're cutting against your knot, because that curve lifts up, you're less likely to cut through your knot, and you can get nice and close. So I'm just going to snip each pair in turn, snip them close to the knot, making sure I don't cut the knot. Again, all the way along the line. And it really is, I think, better to try and just take each pair individually, because then you're less likely to cut through something that you really don't want to do. And again, the very fine point of these scissors makes it much easier to get in. Take those one thread at a time, I think, because they're quite tightly packed. And there we go. So we have got some tiny little ends. They're going to sit on the back of your work and they'll be barely noticeable. So you can also see that I've got the two ends of the pair that the new thread that I added in, and I'm just going to take out the pins around there, and then I can get to those ends and just snip them close to the work where they come in and out. So that's out, thread coming out. There we are. So I'm going to carry on and unpin this, and then I'll do a quick reveal at the end to show you what the piece looks like. So that's the last pins taken out. And if I just shuffle my cover cloth around, turn that over, and there we have the finished coaster. You can find all the details of how to purchase the pattern in the description of the video, or if you don't want to purchase the pattern, obviously I hope that these videos have helped you with some of the techniques in them that you can then use in other pieces that use the same techniques. Thank you for watching.